SHHH, the fire is low, and the stars are already peeking through the Inkai tapestry above. Let the world outside fade away, and come with me not forward, but backward, back to a time when the night was darker, quieter, and filled with little rituals woven gently into the end of each day. Tonight, we're not rushing into history's grand battles or royal intrigue. No, we are moving slowly, gently stepping through the wooden doors of stone cottages, manor houses, and monastic cells. We are visiting the bedtime of another world, a world lit by flickering flame, steeped in superstition, and held together by small comforts. This is a different kind of journey, soft-spoken and sleepy. Together, we'll wander through the final hour of a medieval day through the winding corridors of twilight routines, scented wash basins, softly murmured prayers, and the rustling of bed curtains. You'll hear the faint creak of wooden floors, the hush of whispered tales, the sigh of wind against old shutters. Everything is slowing, preparing for the gentle descent into dreams. So settle in. Let the flickering firelight soothe your eyes. Let your breath grow slower, softer. There's nothing you need to do now except listen. Let's drift together into the quiet rituals of medieval bedtime. How the medieval world slowly dimmed into nightfall without electricity. The sun in the medieval world did not set with drama. It slipped behind the hills slowly, reverently, as if bowing out of a room. Its last golden traces clung to the wooden beams of barns, glinted on metal church spires, and warmed the stone walls of villages one final time before melting into shadow. There were no humming streetlights waiting to buzz to life, no switches to flick, no glowing screens holding back the dark. Night came softly and completely, and everyone noticed it. As the light faded, so too did the rhythm of the day. Fields emptied, tools were set aside, markets wound down, and shutters were drawn closed with a thud, one after another like notes in a slow lullaby. In homes both humble and noble, people moved a little slower, less out of laziness and more out of instinct. Their bodies had been trained by the earth's clock, not one of ticking brass. They lived by the sun, and the sun was saying it was time to rest. Inside a peasant's cottage, the hearth still glowed faintly from the evening stew. There might be the hiss of embers as they settled. A cat curled somewhere nearby. A few worn wooden bowls drying beside a basin. Light came now not from a switch, but from a taper touched to a rushlight, a thin reed dipped in animal fat, burning unevenly, flickering shadows across the walls. A simple thing, but precious. One wouldn't waste a rushlight. The flame meant visibility, and visibility meant hours. So you lit it only when needed, and even then, you were mindful. In wealthier homes, candles of beeswax offered a gentler glow. Golden and rich, they filled chambers with soft, honeyed warmth. But they too were costly. Servants might carry a single candle from room to room, shielding its flame with a cupped hand, their footsteps quiet on cold stone floors. The light was sacred, not just useful. It chased away what the dark might hold: spirits, thieves, thoughts. Outside, the air cooled and the landscape turned dusky. The village green, once filled with chickens pecking or gossip shared over baskets of bread, grew still. Occasionally, the sharp clang of a distant bell might echo from a monastery or church tower. The sound did not mark an hour, as our clocks do today. It marked a feeling, the closing of the day, the gathering of souls, the descent into quiet. Night in the medieval world was full of silence, full of meaning, the kind of full that modern life rarely allows. There was no gentle hum of refrigeration, no far-off buzz of street traffic. The only hum was the hush of the wind weaving through trees, or the flap of a bat's wings in the distance, or the soft murmur of a night prayer whispered by someone kneeling by their bed. You could hear the night approaching long before it fully arrived. You could feel it. You could sense the absence of day. For the people of that time, darkness was not something to conquer. It was something to respect. The world didn't fight the coming night with neon and backlit glass. It leaned into it, People prepared for it, as they would for a storm or a sacred guest. They closed doors. They covered flames. They sat near warmth and drew loved ones close. Some even marked their windows with chalk signs to ward off spirits. In cottages scattered across the countryside, farmers and their families might gather on benches near the hearth. No fire blazed now, only coals glowing like old memories. They spoke in low tones, or didn't speak at all. There was an understanding that the day had earned its rest, and so had they. The bodies were weary, but the minds were calm. And in that slow dimming of everything, in that shared silence, sleep began to drift near. Not suddenly, but like mist curling into corners. Children were wrapped in cloaks or woolen shifts, laid gently on straw pallets or next to older siblings for warmth. Chickens might roost nearby, the occasional soft cluck a comforting presence. In many homes, animals and humans shared the same space, especially in winter. The breath of a cow or the shifting weight of a sheep might have been the last sound someone heard before slumber. And what of the cities? There, too, the light bled away, though more unevenly. A flickering lantern might swing on a hook outside a tavern. A lone guard patrolling the streets could be seen only when he passed directly beneath a torch mounted on a building's wall. But even these were rare. The streets were not places to wander freely at night. People retreated indoors, bolted their doors, and trusted to their locks and their prayers. The noble class behind high stone walls experienced their own version of nightfall. In great halls, the bustle of the day gave way to quieter conversations, slow sips of warmed wine, and the soft brushing of hair by candlelight. Maids might light a row of tapers in the bedchamber, each one dancing gently in the cool air. The heavy tapestries lining the walls caught the light and held it close, while the scent of lavender or rosemary, used to freshen linens, perfumed the room. Still, even for lords and ladies, the dark brought humility. In a time when the unknown was feared as much as it was respected, there was a collective understanding that once the sun departed, the world belonged to something else. Night was a different realm. It wasn't a time for productivity, but for withdrawal. A time to shrink into yourself, to reflect, to pray, or to simply disappear beneath layers of linen and wool and dream. The dark stretched long and deep, especially in winter. In the northern reaches, where daylight was a brief visitor, the night could last for 16 hours or more. But this did not frighten people, not in the way it might today. Their lives were built around it. There were no false suns to keep them alert. They moved with the natural curve of the earth. When it was time to sleep, they slept. And when they woke, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes after a first sleep, they might rise briefly, speak a few words, stoke the fire, and then return to bed for what was known as the second sleep. This rhythm of darkness shaped their dreams. Without artificial light, the body's natural melatonin in rhythm took charge. The stars outside blinked unobstructed. The moon waxed and waned like a gentle pendulum, casting a silver glow over thatched rooftops, cobbled alleys, and lonely fields. Some swore the moon held secrets. Others simply watched it until their eyes grew heavy, and they slipped quietly into sleep. And yet there was fear, too. Not all nights were peaceful. In some villages it was believed that demons walked in the dark, that witches flew in silence, that ghosts wandered in search of the prayers they had never received in life. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were convictions. Protection was necessary. A dried herb bundle hung above a door, a charm beneath the pillow, a cross made of reeds resting on a windowsill. The flame of the rushlight, carefully snuffed, was often the last line of defense between the waking world and what lay beyond. But more often than not, it wasn't dread that filled the darkness. It was reverence. Reverence for the slow way the world dimmed, for the gentle hush that fell across the land, for the flicker of a single candle as it pushed back the blackness, just enough to see your own hands, your own breath, for the knowledge that night, with all its mystery, would cradle you if you let it. And so, every evening in the medieval world, darkness fell not like a threat, but like a veil, a soft, forgiving curtain drawn across the harsh lines of daylight. It smoothed the world, quieted it, pulled everyone inward, and in that hush, without switches, without blue light, without the ceaseless ticking of modern time, people surrendered. They let go, they slept, and now, so can you. Sunset as a daily signal for rest and ritual. There was a time, not so very long ago in the grand story of humanity, when people did not need clocks to know that the day was ending. They didn't glance at numbers or alerts, or scramble through a checklist of late evening obligations. Instead, they simply looked up. The changing light told them everything they needed to know. In the medieval world, the sun itself was the master of time. It was the great unspoken bell, the heavenly candle marking the boundaries of life. And when it began to descend toward the horizon, when it lowered itself like a tired monarch, taking leave of the court, everything else responded. The very land breathed differently in those moments. The birds quieted, the shadows lengthened, the wind softened. It was not just a shift in light. It was a signal to begin the gentle rituals of winding down. For the average person in the Middle Ages, sunset was not a spectacle. It was an instruction. You could almost feel it in your bones. The coolness crept into the air, and with it came a natural pause. The heat of labor fell away. The clang of hammers, the creak of cartwheels, the drone of midday insects all began to fade. The world folded in on itself, slowly, deliberately, as though even nature longed for sleep. In villages and fields scattered across the countryside, farmhands would lift their heads from the soil, their faces smudged with earth and sun. The golden light that bathed the landscape in its final hour was rich and soft, neither day nor night. A kind of in-between space, a holy hush. They called this time eventide. And it was more than just the end of labor. It was the beginning of peace. Mothers would call children back from the hedgerows where they had been gathering berries or chasing chickens. Fathers would carry in the last bundle of hay or douse the forge fire for the night. The sound of footsteps across packed dirt echoed differently now. It was a time for returning, for gathering not just belongings, but people. Sunset meant it was time to draw close. The light inside homes grew slowly, not with a flick of a switch, but with care and ceremony. A rushlight might be lit from a smoldering ember, or a beeswax candle set in an iron sconce by the hearth. The glow would cast long, trembling shadows on the walls, shadows that danced and played across wooden beams and woven mats. These were not bright lights. They were not meant to banish the dark, but to soften it, tame it, make it a friend. Sunset was a time for ritual. In monasteries, the bell would toll for vespers, an ancient evening prayer. Monks would shuffle into the chapel in long robes, their voices low and rhythmic, rising together in chants that echoed beneath stone arches. The sound was timeless, like wind through trees or water over stone. It reminded all who heard it that the day, with all its burdens and glories, was now being offered up to something greater. In towns, the rituals were less formal, but no less meaningful. Tradesmen might take a final count of their wares. Innkeepers swept doorsteps and drew in signs. Housewives stirred one last pot over the fire, while casting glances toward the horizon, watching the sun dip behind distant trees. The orange and rose hues bled into each other like dye soaking into fabric, soft, deep, inevitable. You might hear the faint sound of a shepherd's flute in the distance, or the barking of a dog corralling its flock home. In places where bells did not toll, nature kept its own rhythm. The evening breeze would carry smells from open kitchens, onions, barley, rabbit stew, and the soft rustling of linen being folded, cloaks being draped over weary shoulders. In noble households, the routines were more ornate, but followed the same logic. Ladies retired to their chambers, where maids would loosen laces and brush long hair by firelight. Lords would sip warmed wine and listen to quiet music, perhaps a lute or harp in the corner of the great hall. Conversations, once loud and full of jest, now turned hushed and thoughtful. The day's business was done. The sun's departure demanded a gentler tone. Even the animals felt it. Horses grew calm in their stalls. Chickens fluffed feathers for warmth. Cats stretched before curling near the embers. It was as if the entire world had agreed on a single truth. That night deserved reverence. And so it was given. People did not rush through these transitions. They did not stumble from brightness into sudden dark. The descent into night was slow, almost ceremonial. The sun's last rays touched everything with tenderness, as though reminding the world to be still, to be grateful, to let go. And so they did. They let go. The old women would sit near the fire and begin to hum soft lullabies or half-remembered songs from their childhood. A father might murmur a tale about a knight or a ghost, not to frighten, but to pass the time until little eyes closed. Hands were washed in cool basins, feet were dried, bread was broken. The simplest acts took on meaning in the dimming light. Some believed that sunset was when spirits stirred, neither fully day nor fully night. An hour when the veil between this world and the next grew thin. And so protections were observed. Children might be sprinkled with blessed water. Doors were locked, herbs were hung, prayers were whispered beneath breath. It was not fear so much as caution, a way to acknowledge the unknown and to guard against what might come. But more often, sunset was comfort. It was the daily embrace of slowness, the pause between effort and sleep. It offered the chance to say enough, to place the tools of work aside, to set the body down and let the spirit exhale. And when the last sliver of sun finally vanished beyond the horizon, the night did not pounce, it unfurled. It spread gently across the land, and all things under its velvet shroud seemed quieter, softer, less urgent. A candle flickered in a window, a baby sighed in sleep. The floorboards creaked as someone settled into bed. This rhythm, the rhythm of the sun's rise and fall, was not just natural. It was sacred. It gave people their structure, their space to breathe, their reason to pause. Every sunset was a benediction, a blessing given freely to all who stopped to notice. Rich or poor, farmer or priest, child or elder, it did not matter. The sun's descent called them all home. Even in castles high on hills, surrounded by stone and guarded by knights, the sky outside turned the same molten gold. The same soft blue of approaching dusk crept across the stained glass windows. Even royalty was subject to this clock. Even they stopped to watch. For many, the moment of sunset was a time for gratitude. The day had been long. It had offered food or fatigue, triumph or trouble, but it had passed. And now the light was fading, and that meant a kind of peace. And not always happiness, not always ease, but peace. The kind that comes when the world slows down, when the fire burns low, and when there is nothing left to chase. And as the stars blinked open above the rooftops and rivers, a hush would fall over the land, the kind of hush that speaks volumes, that says you are finished for today, you may rest. And in that permission, in that pause, something deep and old awakened in the soul, something quiet and knowing, something we, even now, might still recognize if we let ourselves slow down long enough to listen. So close your eyes now, as they did then. Let the soft memory of that ancient sunset linger behind your lids. Feel the air cooling on your skin. Hear the creak of a wooden chair, the crackle of a hearth grown dim. Imagine the hush settling across the hills, down into the valleys, through the windows of every home. That hush is for you too. The sun has set, and the world has heard its signal. Now, rest. The warm hush of candlelight and rushlights before bed. There was a moment in every medieval evening when the world seemed to shrink to the size of a single flame. As the last of the day's light slipped away, people turned to candles and rushlights, their tiny beacons against the vast ocean of night. And in that golden hush, A kind of quiet magic settled over homes, monasteries, castles, and cottages alike. It wasn't the blinding, sterile light we know today. It was something gentler, warmer, alive with shadows and depth. The lighting of a candle was never done carelessly. There was ceremony to it, whether you realized it or not. In the poorest cottages, a smouldering ember might be coaxed from the hearth's fading fire. A twist of dried straw, a breath, and then the ember would glow, catching onto the wick of a rushlight. A simple reed dipped in tallow, burning unevenly. It sputtered and hissed at first, the flame licking hungrily at the fat that sustained it. But when it settled, it filled the small space with a dim amber glow, the kind that softened even the harshest corners of a room. In wealthier homes, beeswax candles were prized possessions. Their light was steadier, their scent sweet and resinous, filling chambers with a faint perfume of honey. They did not smoke or sputter as much as tallow, and they were expensive enough that their use was measured carefully. One did not burn a beeswax candle frivolously. Often, a single candle would be carried from room to room, a servant cupping their hand around the flame to shield it from draughts. That one flame might be the only light in a hallway stretching for dozens of feet, the shadows clinging to the walls like waiting ghosts. And it was not just about seeing, it was about mood. Candlelight changed the very way the world felt. It slowed the pace of life, gently insisting that everything soften. The harsh details of daytime work and worry dissolved into glowing outlines. Faces looked gentler in candlelight, their lines smoothed by the flicker of flame. A scarred hand seemed beautiful. A wooden stool seemed carved by care. Even the most ordinary room could look sacred, the light clinging to its surfaces like an embrace. Families gathered close to this light. Children, tired from the day's chores, would cluster near the hearth or the single table, their eyes following the tiny dance of flame. They might lean their heads against their mother's shoulder, the candlelight catching in their hair as she hummed softly, or told a story to carry them toward sleep. These were the final moments of connection before the house surrendered to darkness. The shadows thrown by candles and rushlights were not like the ones cast by modern electric bulbs. They were alive. They shifted with every movement of air, every faint breeze through a crack in the shutter. They could seem comforting one moment, mysterious the next. Some believed those shadows held spirits, and that leaving a flame unattended could invite mischief. Others believed the candlelight itself was protective, driving away the night's unseen dangers. This belief was so strong that many households kept at least one small flame burning all night, even if it meant sacrificing precious fat or wax. In castles and manor houses, candles marked the end of the day with quiet elegance. Servants moved through the halls in hushed procession, snuffing out torches in the great hall, one by one. Only a few key candles remained, set upon carved tables or in elaborate candelabras. The flickering light gleamed on suits of armor, making them seem to breathe, and caught the edges of tapestries, turning woolen scenes of hunts and battles into something living. Upstairs, maids lit candles in bedchambers, their faces glowing softly as they bent over the wicks. They might line a row of tapers on a mantelpiece, the flames reflecting in polished metal and silver goblets, turning the room into a warm cocoon of light. Monasteries had their own relationship with candlelight. The monks, bound by strict hours of prayer, often rose in the middle of the night for their vigils. They moved silently through cloisters lit only by oil lamps or a few solemn candles. The light would fall across their manuscripts, illuminating lines of scripture inked by careful hands. In this world of devotion, the candle's glow was more than practical, it was holy. It was a symbol of God's presence burning steadily in the darkness. And yet, for most ordinary people, candlelight was not just sacred, it was precious. It shaped their entire rhythm of life. A single rushlight might burn for only 30 minutes before it needed replacing. Families planned their evenings around that fragile resource. Meals were eaten quickly, clothes mended by the firelight, prayers whispered with children already nodding off. There was no staying up late into the night unless absolutely necessary. The flickering glow was the quiet clock, and when it died, the day was over. Candlelight and rushlights softened more than just vision. They softened voices. Conversations were quieter at night, the hush of the flame reminding everyone to lower their tones. Secrets were shared in that golden glow, confidences that might never be spoken aloud in daylight. Lovers sat closer, shadows making their eyes brighter. Children nestled into the comfort of familiar arms, lulled by the warmth and the rhythmic crackle of the wick. And when the flame was extinguished, it was not simply a practical act. To snuff out the candle was to surrender fully to the night. The small puff of smoke would curl into the air, carrying with it the scent of tallow or beeswax, and the room would be swallowed by darkness. There was no glow from a distant city, no digital display to guide the way. Darkness was absolute, and it was respected. This was why many people said a prayer before blowing out their candle, asking for protection as they stepped into that deep, quiet void. In some homes, a candle or rushlight was placed in a holder by the bed, so that its glow would be the last thing seen before sleep. The flame's dance across the curtains and ceiling was a comfort, a reminder that the world was still alive even as dreams approached. Children would watch the shadows sway until their eyes could no longer stay open. Parents, mindful of fire, would eventually rise to pinch the wick, plunging the room into true night. There was also the simple beauty of watching the candle burn. People found themselves mesmerized by the way the flame bent and straightened, how it sometimes flared brightly for no reason at all, how it consumed the wax so slowly that you could almost forget it was fading. In a life filled with labor and survival, this quiet act of observation was one of the few moments of stillness. Perhaps it is no wonder that so many found themselves lost in thought as they stared into the light. The materials themselves told a story. Rushlights, for example, were often made from reeds gathered along riverbanks. Families would dry the stalks and dip them in animal fat saved from meals. Beeswax, on the other hand, was gathered painstakingly from hives. It was a substance born of patience and danger. Bees had to be appeased, and wax melted and cleaned before it could be shaped into candles. This was why candles were so valued. They carried within them the work of many hands, the risk of stings, the scarcity of resources. When you burned one, you burned effort, time, and care. And yet, no matter the cost, people continued to light them, because the alternative absolute darkness was far less inviting. Night held its own beauty, but it was also a time of uncertainty. The candle and rushlight created a sanctuary, however small, against that unknown. They gathered families together in their glow, gave lovers a shared warmth, offered monks a way to read sacred texts, allowed artisans to finish one last stitch or carving before bed. If you were to walk through a medieval village at night, you might see the soft glow of candles through small windows, each flicker like a heartbeat. You would hear very little, perhaps the distant bark of a dog, the murmur of voices from within a cottage. But you would feel that hush, that reverence, carried on the air. Each household was its own island of light, surrounded by a sea of dark, and that light was cherished. Even the act of carrying a candle was treated carefully. Servants learned to walk with slow, measured steps, holding the candlestick upright and steady so as not to waste the flame. Travelers, too, might carry a lantern fitted with a single candle inside, the little flame shielded from wind by metal and glass. The light became a companion on lonely paths, a reminder that warmth and safety existed somewhere ahead. In this way, candles and rushlights did more than illuminate. They shaped the human spirit. They marked the transition from day to night, work to rest, wakefulness to sleep. They reminded people of their fragility and their resilience, their dependence on small, precious things. And perhaps most importantly, they encouraged stillness. Because when all you had was a single flickering flame, you could not help but move more slowly, speak more softly, notice more deeply. The warm hush of candlelight before bed was a nightly blessing. It was a reminder that there was beauty in small things, in quiet moments, in the soft surrender of the day. And as you lay in bed, the last of the candle's glow fading from your eyelids, you would feel it, a gentle release. The world outside could wait, the darkness could wait, for now there was rest, and it was enough. Evening prayers and whispered devotions to ward off night spirits. The medieval world was never entirely at ease with the dark. It held beauty, yes, stars glittering overhead, the hush of a world asleep, the whisper of wind through trees. But it also held mystery, uncertainty, and things not easily explained. The night belonged not only to dreams, but to fears. Shadows could seem alive. Winds could howl like voices. And so, every evening, as the light faded and flames flickered lower, people turned to prayer. Not grand sermons or booming declarations, but small, private rituals. Quiet devotions murmured into still rooms. Words passed between lips and the fire, spoken gently so as not to wake sleeping children or alert wandering spirits. Prayer was more than piety, it was protection. The medieval mind lived in a world where the sacred and the supernatural walked side by side. Heaven was close, but so was the other realm, that darker world of demons, curses, witches, and wandering souls. It was believed that evil moved more freely at night, slipping through windows, whispering in dreams, creeping into the minds of the vulnerable. To go to bed without praying was, to many, unthinkable, like leaving your door unlatched in a storm. And so, every evening, after the chores were done, after the candle was lit and the stew had been cleared, the household would fall into a kind of sacred quiet, a stillness not born from sleep, but from reverence. Mothers would gather their children, fathers would bow their heads. Even the smallest hands would learn to fold gently, the way a flower closes at dusk. The prayers began in Latin in the churches and monasteries, but in homes they were often spoken in the mother tongue, Old English, Middle French, or the lilting dialects of the countryside. The words changed by region, but the shape of the ritual remained, a sign of the cross, a whispered Ave, a petition to Saint Michael to guard the soul through the night, to Mary for mercy, to Christ for rest. In many homes, a crucifix hung above the hearth, worn and darkened by years of smoke and devotion. Before bed, someone would stand before it, sometimes a child no taller than the table, and whisper words so soft they barely disturbed the air. Perhaps something like, "Keep me this night from sin and sorrow. Let no foul thing touch my dreams. Let the holy ones walk beside me." And not poetry, but pleading. Monasteries and abbeys, of course, had their own nightly order. As darkness thickened and torches were lowered, monks would gather for compline, the final office of the day. Their voices rose in slow, measured chant, echoing off stone walls lit by the flickering of oil lamps. There was comfort in their unity, in the rhythm of many voices speaking one prayer. They asked for mercy, for forgiveness of all sins done that day, and for protection through the shadowed hours to come. Their Latin psalms, solemn and deliberate, reached upward into the vaulted ceiling, into the night beyond. Back in the villages, peasants crafted their own versions of these sacred protections. Many believed that simply reciting the Lord's Prayer 3 times would guard one's soul as it traveled through sleep. Others kept small devotional tokens beneath their pillows, wooden crosses, bits of relic cloth, even handwritten verses on worn parchment. Some stitched charms into the hems of nightshirts, or kept sprigs of blessed herbs tied with red string on the windowsill. It was also common to invoke the names of saints. Saint George was called upon to protect against nightmares, Saint Bridget for peaceful dreams, Saint Christopher for those who feared the unknown path their spirit might wander while the body rested. Names were whispered like lullabies. The room might be silent but for the fire's soft pop, and the lips of a weary soul whispering, Saint Agnes, guard my heart, Saint Michael, guard my Dord. Children especially were taught these prayers, not to frighten them, but to arm them. A little boy might lie beneath a woolen blanket, the bed stuffed with straw and feathers, hands tucked together beneath his chin, murmuring with sleepy confidence, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lie on. That rhyme, old even then, echoed across centuries. It gave form to the formless night. It offered structure, safety, meaning, a belief that someone was watching over them even as the candle guttered out. In castles, the nightly devotions were more elaborate, though no less sincere. Nobles knelt at carved wooden prie-dieu, heads bowed beneath heavy linen nightcaps, the velvet of their robes pooled around them. Sometimes they read from illuminated prayer books, books so rare and costly they were handled like gold. The pages turned slowly, the words traced with reverent fingers. They, too, feared the dark. Even behind stone walls and guarded gates, the night crept in. They prayed not only for their own safety, but for that of their households, for the servants, the children, the soldiers sleeping in barracks, for forgiveness of debts and sins, spoken or not, for dreams to be merciful. It was said that the devil worked best when men dreamed, and so dreams themselves were prayed over. Keep my mind clean, one prayer might ask, let no demon speak to me in sleep. There was a hush to these moments, a gentle pause that blanketed the room like snowfall. The candle's light would tremble, as if moved by breath alone. The dog at the foot of the bed might lift its head, sensing the shift in tone. In those moments, the line between the visible and the invisible world seemed very thin indeed. A flickering flame, a bowed head, and the night just outside, listening. And then there were the whispered blessings shared between loved ones. Parents would lean over their children, draw small crosses on their foreheads with fingers still warm from the fire. Sleep well, they might say, or God guard you, or simply, no spirits come near. Husbands and wives murmured parting words before turning to separate sides of the bed. These blessings were often no longer than a breath, but they carried centuries of belief behind them. In some households, holy water was sprinkled lightly on the bed sheets, a few drops, cool and quiet, like a kiss from the divine. Others hung rosaries or relics above the bed, letting them dangle like watchful eyes. No one wanted to face the night unguarded. Even the bravest warrior laid down his sword before laying down his head. But he never forgot the prayer. And what of those who had no roof, no hearth, no family to share these sacred moments with? The travelers, the monks on pilgrimage, the poor, they prayed beneath stars, their breath curling into the night. Their voices were low, unsure, but still they prayed. Cover me, Lord, with the cloak of your mercy, they might say, pulling a ragged blanket tighter. Let not the devil take my soul before morning light. Because that was the fear, that the soul might slip away, unnoticed, unguarded, that the dark would take more than sleep. And so the words came every night like rituals carved into the bones of the people. Not always the same words, not always elegant, but always faithful. Even the sound of these whispered prayers had power. The murmuring became a lullaby in itself. As one drifted toward sleep, the last thing one might hear was not the wind or the creak of timber, but the soft chant of a mother or the rhythmic cadence of a father's familiar voice. In some ways, that sound was more comforting than any blanket, and when sleep finally took hold, when the eyes closed and the breath slowed and the world faded into that deep, formless velvet, those whispered prayers remained, carried like small lanterns in the dark, a guide, a shield, a reminder that not even the blackest night was empty. Somewhere out in the fields, an owl might call. A door might groan gently on its hinge, but inside, beneath rough beams or painted ceilings, beneath thatched roofs or towers of stone, a flame flickered. A prayer lingered, and the night, mysterious as it was, held back. Because the people had spoken, they had whispered their devotions, and the spirits, for now, had heard. the roll of herbal sachets and sleep charms placed beneath pillows. As darkness settled gently over the medieval world, and the fires dimmed to a glowing hush, there was one final ritual many turned to before surrendering to sleep. It was not spoken, nor always even seen, no grand prayer, no solemn procession, no litany in Latin. It was quiet, practical, steeped in old wisdom and tender superstition, and it lived beneath the pillow. In an age when medicine was still mysterious and dreams were considered a bridge to the divine, or to the demonic people reached for what they understood, the gifts of the earth, dried herbs gathered in the spring, bound with red thread, kissed by candlelight and tucked carefully beneath linen or wool. These were the sachets, the sleep charms, and the bundles of natural magic that rested close to sleeping heads. The act was simple, to place something under your pillow, but its meaning was rich. In those days, when the night was believed to be thick with wandering spirits, shifting moods, and invisible forces, the pillow became a sacred space, the place where your head, your thoughts, your soul lay defenseless. And so people guarded it, not with weapons or walls, but with scent, with symbols, with ancient plants whose very names whispered protection. Lavender, soft and silvery, was a favorite. In medieval herbals, it was praised not just for its fragrance, but for its power to calm the mind, to repel phantasma. As one monk wrote, a few dried stalks, bundled into a linen pouch or stitched into the seam of a pillow, were thought to soothe the anxious, quiet the overactive humors, and ward off dark dreams. The scent lingered long after the sachet was placed, curling into the nose with every breath, like a lullaby of the fields. Chamomile was another, small, daisy, like blossoms harvested under gentle sun, dried on wooden racks and crumbled into tiny velvet pouches. The old wives believed that chamomile brought peace to restless children and cooled the tempers of fevered men. Beneath a pillow, it was thought to guide the sleeper toward dreams of still waters and kind voices. Then there was mugwort, less fragrant, but far more potent in lore, called the dreaming herb, by some and the witch's plant. By others, mugwort was said to stir the mind into visions, to open the gates between sleep and sight. Soldiers sometimes carried it into battle, tucked in their boots for stamina, but at night it served a quieter purpose. For those who placed mugwort beneath their heads, dreams might come vivid and strange. Some believed it allowed you to glimpse truth's omens, futures, the voices of the dead. Not all dared to use it, but for those who did, it became a trusted companion of the night. The sachets themselves were humble things, scraps of cloth cut from worn dresses, old cloaks, or kitchen linens. A child's outgrown smock might be repurposed to hold rosemary and sage. A monk's cast-off robe might be used for a bundle of marjoram and thyme. These pouches were tied with care, often with red thread, a color believed to repel evil, and knotted 3 times for luck or for the Trinity. Sometimes mothers made these bundles for their children, whispering old rhymes as they filled the cloth. Sleep now, sleep light, guarded by herbs through the night. No devil shall dare, no witch shall see, my child shall rest safe beside me. The herbs were not chosen at random. Each had its purpose, its energy. Sage for wisdom, fennel for protection, rue for driving away illness. Valerian, though bitter to the nose, was used for deeper sleep. Its scent said to lull the nerves like a warm draught of wine. A few brave souls even added crushed poppy petals, not the heavy sleep of death, but the dreamy, floating kind that the poets loved. And there were charms too. Not every pillow held only herbs. Some held tokens, symbols passed down from mothers and grandmothers. A piece of iron, small and smooth, was thought to confuse the fae or ward off nightmares. A carved piece of bone, etched with a cross or a sunwheel. Some households placed a bit of bread wrapped in cloth, a gift for wandering spirits, so they might pass over without malice. Sleep, in the medieval mind, was not passive. It was a journey, a crossing. One could be vulnerable in sleep. One could be watched, even taken, and so the space around the head, around the pillow, became a sort of fortress. Not with bricks and beams, but with scent and symbol. A fortress of the senses, of belief. The wealthier homes often had sachets embroidered with charms, tiny script, stitched in careful lines. Latin, verses from the Psalms, names of saints, even the sacred tetragrammaton, if one could find someone brave enough to write it. These were sewn in secret, passed from chambermaids to daughters, from nursemaids to young brides. A sachet wasn't just a bed companion. It was an heirloom of protection. In monasteries, the monks sometimes slept with rosaries in hand, but others placed lavender beneath their heads, just as the villagers did. One scribe, in a note scrawled into the margin of a manuscript, confessed to dreaming of angels after placing dried violets beneath his pillow, Flores violarum. He wrote, brought a silence to my dreams. And what of the skeptics? They existed, of course. Those who thought it mere superstition. But even they, in the quiet of their rooms, after the candle had been pinched out and the wind creaked through the shutters, might reach for a bundle of rosemary or a charm gifted by a grandmother. Long past, because sleep made everyone small, and the night was very large. Children were the most closely guarded. Parents left no stone unturned to keep their children safe through the dangerous hours between dusk and dawn. Beneath a baby's cradle, bunches of herbs were hung or laid, mint, betony, angelica. Sometimes carved wooden dolls filled with herbs were placed beside infants, their scent soft and earthy, like the garden in early spring. These dolls were believed to watch over the child, to draw sickness and bad spirits away. A silent guardian of the night. Not all sachets were meant to calm. Some were designed to awaken the senses in dreams. Lovers might sleep with rose petals or cinnamon bark beneath their pillows, hoping to dream of their beloved. Wives hoping for conception might use vervain or clover. Soldiers returning from battle placed their swords beside them, but tucked yarrow and bay leaves beneath their pillows, to keep away the ghosts of war. In every case, it was the earth that offered comfort, not a loud protection, but a soft one, a whisper of lavender, a murmur of marjoram, a sigh of sage. In the hush of the medieval bedroom, whether stone castle or wooden hut, these small bundles were tucked beneath coarse wool or soft feather, beneath flax or homespun cloth. The sleep charms weren't always believed to be magical in a fairy tale sense. They were practical, too. The herbs repelled insects, soothed headaches, cleared the sinuses. In the summer, they masked the scent of sweat and hay. In winter, they reminded one of green fields and warmer winds. The psychological comfort, even then, was not lost on them. They knew these bundles worked, even if they couldn't always say how. And so, every night, the ritual repeated. A sachet was held in the hand, then pressed into place beneath the pillow with the same reverence one might give to a sacred relic. Not rushed, not casual, but deliberate, a moment of mindfulness before sleep, a deep breath of lavender. A final thought of safety, and in that moment the world seemed smaller. The wolves at the edge of the forest felt farther away. The witch at the window became a figment. The demon under the bed, forgotten, all because of a bundle of herbs, a pouch of scent, a charm passed from one careful hand to another. When morning came, the sachet was shaken out, refreshed, perhaps kissed before being returned to its rightful place. And the cycle began anew. Another night, another sleep. Another dream, protected by earth and thread and hope. Even now, across the centuries, if you close your eyes and breathe deeply, you might almost catch the scent. The mingling of lavender and thyme, of wood smoke and wool, of faith and superstition. It drifts through time, unchanged, because somewhere, a long time ago, someone else is pressing a sachet beneath their pillow, whispering a charm, and waiting for sleep to come. And when it does, it comes softly, always softly. How sleep was considered a spiritual act, surrounded by prayer and superstition, The medieval night was not silent. Even in the stillest hours there were sounds. The rustle of straw beneath a blanket, the creak of timbers in the ceiling, the occasional sigh of wind slipping through stone cracks. But beneath those sounds there was something deeper, something softer, the hum of prayer, the whisper of old superstition. Because in the Middle Ages, sleep was not simply a physical need. It was a threshold, a passage, a spiritual act cloaked in mystery. Before lying down, few would have dared to simply close their eyes without ceremony. Sleep was not taken for granted. It was entered with intention, with reverence. Just as one bowed before the altar or crossed oneself at a holy relic, one prepared the soul for slumber, because in sleep one left the waking world behind. And no one could ever be certain they would return. For the peasant in a lowly thatched cottage, as much as for the monk in his stone cell or the noble in a feathered bed, the ritual began with prayer. Hands clasped beneath the chin, fingers laced tightly, or in some households, palms flat to the chest. A short, mumbled blessing, sometimes in Latin, often in the vernacular, spoken not just for oneself, but for the soul. To lie down without a prayer was to risk leaving the world unprotected. "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit," many whispered as they laid their heads upon coarse pillows or folded arms. It was the same line Christ himself had uttered upon the cross, and in medieval thought, it was a fitting sentence to offer before slipping into the mysterious vulnerability of sleep. Because who knew if one would wake again? Night was sacred, but it was also dangerous. The darkness was not simply the absence of light. It was a living, shifting thing, home to demons, spirits, and all manner of invisible forces. The devil, it was believed, was most active between midnight and the cock's crow, and so sleep, that natural surrender, became a kind of offering. A willing descent into the unknown, the body stilled, the mind drifted, and the soul became momentarily unmoored. This was why, across Christendom, prayers were spoken aloud before sleep, not just in churches, but in cottages, inns, manor houses, and castles. There was a prayer for safety, a prayer for dreams, a prayer for forgiveness of sins should the night prove final, and in many homes a candle was lit and left burning until the last whisper of prayer had faded into the beams. Some prayers were memorized from childhood, others were whispered improvisations. Many began with the invocation of guardian angels. "Angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here." The familiar rhythm calmed the heart, a reminder that even in sleep one was not alone. Every night a quiet army of angels was imagined hovering over bedsides, swords drawn against evil, wings unfurled to guard the soul's journey. Even the position in which one slept was thought to hold meaning. The right side was considered wholly associated with Christ and the saved. Sleeping on one's left was more suspect, linked with the unrighteous, and for some, even an invitation to devilish influence. Many made a deliberate effort to settle on their right, especially in the first minutes of rest, as if aligning themselves with heaven itself. In the wealthier chambers, embroidered tapestries bearing saints and sacred symbols hung behind beds, not merely for decoration, but for spiritual defense. The saints served as protectors in the night. St. Michael the Archangel, who cast Satan from heaven, was especially favored. His image, wings wide, sword in hand, watched over many sleepers from stitched linen and painted wood. In poorer homes, simple wooden crosses were hung above the bed, or etched into the headboard itself. Superstition and religion were not separate, but woven tightly together. Few saw a contradiction in praying to Christ and hanging an iron nail above the bed to ward off spirits. Faith was both sacred and practical. It offered comfort, yes, but it also offered insurance. If a spirit of the night came knocking, the sleeper was armed with all they could muster: prayer, symbol, and belief. Children were taught early. A mother's lullaby often folded into a prayer. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Bless this bed that I lie on't, I charm as much as a rhyme. The 4 evangelists were imagined standing watch, one at each corner of the bed, forming a spiritual fortress around the slumbering child. The image was comforting, that even in sleep, one was known, protected, and held. Monasteries, too, were rich in nocturnal ritual. The night was divided by bells and hours, each rung with purpose. Though monks rose for matins in the early dark, often before the sun had stirred, they too went to bed with prayers whispered into the woolen dark. Some kissed their rosaries before laying them beside the cot. Others murmured psalms until sleep overcame them like a gentle tide. And dreams, oh, dreams were not dismissed as idle fancies. They were messages, warnings, visions from God, or temptations from below. The medieval sleeper was not just a body in rest, but a traveler. Each dream, each murmur in the night, could contain sacred meaning. Monks recorded their dreams in journals, queens consulted priests, shepherds recalled the visions they saw beneath stars. If one dreamt of light, of water, of stairways or angels, it was taken as a good omen. If one dreamt of beasts, fire, or darkened churches, the following day might be spent in penance. To forget to pray before sleep was not merely careless. It might invite dreams that were troubling, misleading, even dangerous. Better to guard the gates of sleep carefully. There were even charms, short phrases etched on parchment or metal, worn around the neck or tucked under pillows, meant to preserve the purity of dreams. These charms, sometimes blessed by priests, sometimes prepared by village wise women, often bore sacred words or names. The letters Ike or Inri, symbols of Christ, or even obscure angelic names from old apocryphal texts. Their power, it was believed, lay in the speaking of them. The words were the armor of the soul, and in times of plague or hardship, sleep took on even greater spiritual weight. When death loomed close, people prayed harder before closing their eyes. Some would confess their sins nightly, afraid that the fever might take them before morning. Husbands whispered apologies, mothers begged for their children's safety. Entire families knelt by their beds, together in the candlelight, voices low and tremulous. But there was also beauty in it, peace, for those who had prayed well, who had forgiven, who had placed their faith in God, and warded their bed with sign and sachet. Sleep was a sacred surrender, a folding in of the self, a small death, yes, but one that promised a return. In the countryside, old women told tales of saints who appeared in dreams, offering blessings or advice. In some towns, it was said that if you prayed to a certain saint before sleep, they might appear in your dream to answer a question. These weren't fantasies, they were testimonies offered in the same breath as any miracle, and yet, for all this sacredness, sleep remained ordinary. It arrived slowly, tenderly. Even the most devout, having whispered their prayers, having crossed themselves and placed charms under their pillows, eventually drifted off with a yawn, a shift beneath the blanket, the body curling in search of comfort. They slept as we do, they breathed deeply, they stirred, they dreamed. And even in those dreams, the echoes of their prayers remained. So now, as you lay your own head down, centuries away from those who came before, you can still feel the thread that connects you to them. That hush before sleep, that final thought of safety, of grace, the sense that even now some part of you is watched over, that to close your eyes is not to fall, but to be cradled, to enter the sacred stillness of sleep, the arrangement of beds and sleeping positions, status, safety, and symbolism. The bed was never just a bed in the medieval world. It was a place of shelter, a symbol of status, a stage for ritual, a site of intimacy, and most of all, a barrier against the cold uncertainties of night. One did not simply lie down in the medieval bed. One entered it, often with purpose, sometimes with ceremony, always with an awareness of place, of safety, of order. The arrangement of a sleeping space told a story, not just of wealth or poverty, but of values, of fears, of what mattered after dark, when the world was quieter and one's defenses were lowered. If you were to step softly into a medieval home, just as the last candle was sputtering out, and look around the sleeping space, you'd learn much before a single word was spoken. In the halls of nobility, beds stood high above the ground, elevated, sometimes chest height, requiring a stool or a hand from a servant to mount. This wasn't just for show. It kept the sleeper away from cold stone floors and scurrying pests. But more than that, height symbolized power. The bed itself was often the most expensive piece of furniture in the home, carved from oak, canopied with embroidered fabric, draped in linen dyed with colors reserved for wealth. It was more than a place to rest. It was a throne for the unconscious hours. And these beds weren't hidden away. In the earliest medieval period, even a lord's bed might be located in the great hall, curtained off but still central, visible by daylight, and surrounded by the comings and goings of the household. Later, they were moved into solar chambers, private, lofty rooms, accessible only to those with status. To sleep in a bed alone was not common. It was a privilege. Most people slept near others, sharing warmth, body heat, and protection. For peasants, the bed was simpler, often little more than a wooden frame with a lumpy straw mattress. It may have rested directly on the earthen floor or been slightly raised. Families of 5, 6, even 10 would share sleeping quarters, sometimes all in one bed, more often spread across layers of blankets and woven mats laid near the hearth. Children might nestle beside parents, grandparents curled in corners. Privacy was a distant concept. And yet, even within the most modest homes, the bed's position was chosen with care. Often it was placed against the wall furthest from the door, safest from drafts and intrusions. In some homes, the bed was positioned to face east, toward the rising sun, echoing Christian symbolism of rebirth and resurrection. In others, it faced the hearth, so warmth might reach the feet. Sleeping positions, too, mattered. The medieval body didn't sprawl. It assumed posture. Couples were expected to lie in particular ways, wives often on the left, husbands on the right. Children curled in close. In monasteries, monks slept side by side in dormitories, lying fully clothed atop straw mattresses, arranged like brothers in eternal rest. Their beds were narrow, often little more than wooden coffins with blankets. They lay on their backs or sides, hands over their chests, mimicking the posture of burial. Even in sleep, they rehearsed death peacefully, piously. In noble households, sleeping arrangements followed complex codes. A guest of high status might be invited to share the bed of the host, not necessarily as an act of intimacy, but as a gesture of trust and honor. This could be deeply symbolic, like a compact between equals. Meanwhile, servants and retainers would sleep on pallets nearby, ready to assist at a moment's notice, their ears always half awake. And still, safety lingered behind every arrangement. The medieval night held dangers beyond dreams. Robbers, witches, wolves, fire, so families huddled close. Doors were barred, shutters drawn, beds pushed near walls or under lofted beams to give a sense of enclosure. In some towns, laws even required candles to be snuffed out before bed to prevent accidental flames. Households observed these nightly rituals religiously, not just to stay warm, but to stay alive. The canopy bed became a favorite of the wealthy, not just for its elegance, but for its function. Drapes could be drawn to trap heat and block out drafts. They provided privacy in crowded homes, muffling whispers and shielding sleepers from prying eyes. But they also carried layers of symbolism, protection from spiritual forces, a sacred barrier between the waking world and the realm of dreams. These beds were often passed down generations. They were treasured items, sometimes with names, sometimes with carved inscriptions. A noble woman might bring a feather bed into marriage as part of her dowry, and in some rare instances, People even made deathbed requests about how they wished to be laid within the same bed that cradled their life's sleep. For the sick or elderly, the arrangement of the bed became even more significant. It was cleaned, blessed, turned to face particular directions. Family members would take turns sitting nearby. In some places, small bells were hung near the bed's headboard, meant to summon help if the sleeper became distressed in the night. These were not superstitions, they were lifelines, woven into the fabric of how the medieval mind understood sleep as a time of vulnerability. Among the very devout, it was common to hang relics or crosses over the bed. Some even inscribed holy phrases directly into the wooden beams. These were not merely decorative. The bed, in their eyes, was a sacred place. Dreams were not simply dreams, but spiritual encounters. Nightmares were battles with temptation. A restless sleep could be a sign of unconfessed sin, and so the bed became a battleground, one that needed armor. And what of those who had no beds at all? The poor, the homeless, the pilgrims traveling rough roads to shrines. They slept where they could, in haylofts under trees, beside abbey walls. And yet even they followed certain customs. Shoes were removed and placed beside the head to ward off spirits. A blanket was drawn tight across the chest. Some clutched prayer beads in their sleep, the worn wood of each bead offering the comfort of rhythm. In inns and public houses, strangers often slept side by side. It was not uncommon for travelers to share a bed with someone they'd only just met. This could be awkward, but also practical. In the cold months, body heat was survival. And in a world where comfort was rare, the simple luxury of lying on a straw mattress with a roof overhead could feel divine. There were stories of friendships formed in such beds, secrets shared, songs whispered until one or both fell asleep. In convents, the sleeping arrangements were serene, quiet. Sisters filed into their dormitories like shadows. Each bed was the same, simple, sparse, a wooden frame, a rough mattress, woolen blankets, no personal trinkets. Just the rhythm of breath, the occasional creak of floorboards, and perhaps the distant tolling of the bell tower marking the hour. Throughout all these variations, noble, poor, religious, itinerant sleeping arrangements reflected the world each person inhabited. How close they were to power, how far from safety, how seriously they took the sacred act of rest. But across them all, there was one common thread, the longing for peace in the night, to drift into sleep knowing one was warm, protected, and prepared for whatever dreams or dawn might come. Even lovers had their own coded choreography in bed. In poetry and courtly tradition, the placement of arms, the turn of the body, even which side of the bed one chose could signal affection or withdrawal. A hand brushed along a sleeve, a sigh shared on the same pillow. These were the silent languages of the bed, understood only in shadow and stillness. And when a child was born, a new sleeping arrangement began. The baby swaddled tightly, tucked between mother and wall to avoid accidental smothering. A charm pinned to the blanket, a lullaby sung as the hearth's last embers winked out. The child would learn from birth that sleep was both gift and gamble, protected by love and ritual. So now, as the modern world hums beyond your window screens glowing, engines humming, perhaps there is something comforting in this ancient architecture of sleep, that no matter how simple or ornate the bed, no matter how many centuries have passed, we still arrange ourselves each night in the search for the same thing. Not just rest, but safety, warmth, connection, the soft miracle of waking again. And just like them, you now lie still. Listening to the hush between words, the spaces between breaths, you too are cradled by layers of quiet intention, the same quiet humanity that has folded into beds for 1,000 years. Sleep now, gently, carefully, just as they did. And may your dreams be peaceful, protected, and full of light. Children's bedtime routines, lullabies, prayers, and nightly reassurances It's a quiet evening in a small timber-framed cottage where the hearth still smoulders softly, its orange glow flickering across the earthen floor. A child lies nestled against their mother, eyes heavy, cheeks flushed with the warmth of firelight. Outside, the fields sleep beneath the hush of twilight, and the wind brushes against wooden shutters. The medieval world, vast and sometimes harsh, has for a moment grown gentle, and so begins one of the oldest human rituals, putting a child to bed. In the Middle Ages, the bedtime routine for children was not what we might recognize today. There were no pajamas, no bedtime books lined neatly on a shelf, no soft nightlights humming. But what there was, what echoed just as deeply, were words, spoken gently, sung softly, prayers whispered into little ears, touches light as breath, all wrapped in rhythm, repetition, and love. It began, as most things did, with the hearth. The dying fire offered comfort. Its warmth was essential, especially in colder seasons, and children often slept as close to it as was safe, sometimes even on mats directly beside the stones. The flickering light played across their faces, dancing in their half-lidded eyes. The fire, after all, was not just heat. It was security, a ward against darkness. A hearth meant home, and children learned to associate its glow with the promise of sleep. Mothers, and sometimes elder siblings or nursemaids, took great care in settling the youngest children. In peasant households, children would often share a bed with their parents or each other. Space was limited, and warmth was shared. In noble homes, a child might have a small wooden bed, simple but well crafted, tucked near the mother's chamber or within the nursery. Bedding varied by status: straws, tuft mattresses in the cottages, feather, filled bolsters for the well-born. But regardless of wealth, the gestures of bedtime echoed each other. A blanket pulled over small shoulders, a whispered rhyme, a protective touch. And then came the lullabies. The lullaby was not invented in modern nurseries. It is as old as cradle and voice. In medieval times, lullabies were passed from mother to daughter, orally preserved through generations. The melodies were simple, but not always sweet. Some were prayers in disguise, folded into song. Others were protective chants, intended to ward off spirits and illness. A mother might croon softly, "Lullaby, mine liking, my dear son, my sweeting, lullaby, my dear heart, mine own dear darling." These were not just words of comfort, they were declarations of love in a world where childhood could be precarious. The lullaby was a spell of care, designed to soothe a child into stillness and shield them as they slipped into dreams. They were sung with slow rocking, the body creating rhythm where instruments were absent. Even the creak of a wooden cradle or the shifting of floorboards might join the night's quiet orchestra. Many lullabies held religious undertones. Mothers often sang about the Virgin Mary and baby Jesus, drawing a tender parallel between their child and the Christ child. Songs like "Lullaby, Lullaby, Little Child" were both lullaby and devotion, reminders that even the holiest once cried in the night and needed gentle shushing. Singing about saints and angels also served as nighttime reassurance. If the parent could not always protect the child, perhaps a holy guardian could. Before sleep fully took hold, prayers followed. A common medieval bedtime prayer for children began, "In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spiritum meum." "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirits." For many, this prayer was recited nightly, as regular as breathing. It was believed to safeguard the soul through the vulnerabilities of sleep, a time when one might be visited by dreams, spirits, or even death. Children were taught early that sleep was not guaranteed to end in waking, so prayer became habit, a shield, a whispered offering to the divine. Mothers often guided small hands to cross themselves before bed. A few may have even traced a small cross onto the child's forehead or chest, protective gestures believed to keep demons at bay. In some homes, amulets were tied around a child's neck or wrist, herbs sewn into little cloth pouches, or scraps of parchment with Latin scripture written on them. These talismans were rarely questioned. They were part of the nightly costume of sleep, rituals worn against the unknown. Children, of course, asked questions. What lives in the dark? What makes that sound at night? Will the fire go out? Their world was filled with shadows and mystery. And so the adults crafted stories to soothe them, tales of kind fairies that watched over good children, of gentle saints who visited dreams, or guardian animals who lay by the door and kept danger away. Even bedtime placement reflected a deep sense of order. In households where multiple children shared a sleeping space, the youngest might sleep closest to the mother, with older children arrayed outward by age. Sometimes girls and boys were separated, or children were placed according to temperament, quiet ones together, fidgety ones near a supervising adult. It wasn't discipline, it was rhythm, the nightly choreography of sleep. In wealthier homes, nursemaids or governesses oversaw bedtime. Children were dressed in linen nightshifts and tucked into small canopied beds with embroidered covers. Their prayers were often said aloud in Latin, echoing church services, even if the child did not yet understand the words. A gentle hand smoothed hair, adjusted pillows, and kissed foreheads good night. The routine was formal, yet filled with affection. For all their rank and structure, noble households still cherished the stillness of watching a child fall asleep. And for many children, sleep did not come in long, uninterrupted stretches. The concept of sleeping through the night is relatively modern. Medieval children, like adults, often woke in the middle of the night. Some were comforted back to sleep with murmured words or soft back pats. Others might be given a sip of warm broth or milk. If they had nightmares, the solution was rarely analytical, it was spiritual. A quick prayer, a touch of blessed water, or the recitation of a charm could help ease their return to slumber. Children who had lost a parent were often reassured through nightly ritual. A grandmother's voice took on the mother's lullaby. An older sibling repeated the prayers they once said together. The rhythms of bedtime became a balm for grief. Softly, slowly, sleep returned, not as escape but as restoration. In monasteries, where orphaned or noble boys were sometimes raised, bedtime was more austere. Children filed silently into shared dormitories, each to their narrow bed. Talking was discouraged. They slept in their undertunics, heads covered with caps in the cold months. But even here, someone watched over them. A senior monk or novice master might walk quietly between beds, ensuring that all was still, all was peaceful. Candles burned low, and somewhere in the background, a psalm hummed like distant thunder, anchoring even the most anxious heart. By contrast, in country cottages, bedtime might include a lullaby sung by an older sister, while others murmured in low voices nearby. A baby clutched a wooden toy or a scrap of blanket. A father poked at the coals one last time. The smell of bread or stew lingered faintly in the air. The rhythms of home held the children close day's end, wrapped in smells, sounds, and softness. Some bedtime reassurances were spoken in hushed repetition, like mantras. "You are safe, child. The saints are watching. The fire is warm. Mother is near." These simple phrases, repeated night after night, became their own kind of magic spoken charms that drifted down with sleep, wrapping around the child like a second blanket. And sometimes there were stories, not always long or elaborate, just fragments. A tale of a brave boy who walked the forest, but always found his way home. A gentle donkey who carried bread to the poor. A little girl who saw a star fall and was blessed with kind dreams forever. Stories told in low voices, half-whispered, meant not to be finished, but to be drifted into. Bedtime in the medieval world was not perfect. Children still had fears. Sleep was still unpredictable. But these rituals, these lullabies, prayers, gestures, and whispered words, made bedtime into something more than a necessity. It became a sacred space, a daily act of love, of surrender, of trust. And even now, Centuries later, as you listen to this from the comfort of your own quiet room, you may hear faint echoes of those ancient voices. The soft breath of a mother humming beside the hearth, the scratch of linen as a child rolls toward warmth, the rhythm of a lullaby woven into silence. You, too, once heard songs meant to coax you gently into the dark. And perhaps, somewhere deep in memory, your body still responds to that, to the quiet reassurance that sleep is safe, that night holds its own kind of grace, that, like those medieval children, you are watched over, by memory, by rhythm, by love. So now, close your eyes, let the wind rest against the shutters, let the embers settle low. The lullabies may be silent now, but they still hum in the bones of history. And they hum for you too. Sleep, little one, sleep. The fear of night spirits and how parents protected children. The medieval world did not slip easily into night. It settled into it slowly, with trepidation and tradition. When the sun lowered behind the hills, and the sky faded from blue to a deep and ancient black, people did not just grow tired. They became watchful. The dark in those days was not simply an absence of light. It was the domain of things unseen, things whispered about by firelight, things whose names were not spoken aloud after dusk. Children, most of all, were thought to be vulnerable. Their dreams were soft and unformed, their minds still closed to mystery. And in medieval households, whether grand or humble, the descent into sleep was often accompanied by quiet dread. And not just of bad dreams, but of spirits, of night hags, witches, fairies gone sour, or the shifting shadows that crept through keyholes and down stone walls. And so, parents developed quiet rituals of protection, some spiritual, some superstitious, all tender. As the last embers in the hearth were stirred and banked, a mother might cross herself once more, or trace a sign upon the lintel of the bedchamber door. Ash from the fireplace was sometimes drawn into shapes across thresholds, believed to bar the entry of restless spirits. In corners, bundles of dried herbs, sage, lavender, mugwort, were tucked into rafters or hung beside the door. These were not for scent alone. Mugwort, in particular, was believed to protect against night wanderings and evil dreams. To medieval folk, its aroma had the power to weave a boundary between the dreaming world and the realm of the malevolent unseen. Over the child's cradle or pallet, charms might be placed, a tiny cross carved from holly wood, a piece of parchment with a Latin verse looped onto a string and tied to the bedpost. Or, more simply, a child might sleep with a clove of garlic beneath the pillow, or a piece of iron tucked into the mattress straw. Iron was thought to repel the Fae, the Shea, those capricious spirits from older beliefs, who might steal a sleeping child and leave behind a changeling, quiet and watchful, and not quite right. For children who slept restlessly, crying out in their dreams or waking in tears, the medieval answer was rarely psychological. It was spiritual, elemental. A frightened child had perhaps seen something from the other side, a wisp, a shadow, or been brushed by a spirit's passing. And so a parent would rise, wrap the child in a woolen cloak, still warm from the hearth, and whisper charms passed down from a grandmother's grandmother. Away, away, ye spirits of ill, this child is blessed, and sleeps here still. God's hand above, Saint Mary near, no shadow shall harm, no spirit come here. The words didn't need to be remembered precisely. The rhythm, the certainty in the voice, that was the magic. In rural villages, night held sounds that children feared. The howl of wind through the thatch, the creak of tree limbs, the distant baying of dogs or wolves. And every sound had a story. A groaning beam might be said to be the ghost of a murdered priest, the whimpering of a fox mistaken for a soul in torment. The wind itself could carry whispers of witches mid-flight, of curses drifting like smoke. To soothe these fears, parents painted the night in gentler tones. "It's St. Cuthbert riding the clouds," they might say, or the owls sing when the saints light their lamps. They baptize the dark in story, reshaping dread into awe. The nighttime became a space of myth, not empty and threatening, but full of sacred presence. The role of holy relics cannot be overstated. In some homes, a fragment of bone, a splinter of wood from a holy shrine, or a scrap of fabric blessed by a priest was kept near the child's sleeping space. These were precious, rare objects touched by the divine, and thus incorruptible by evil. Parents believed that the saints watched over their children at night, just as surely as they watched from cathedral windows by day. In wealthier households, protective icons were painted above the child's bed, Madonna and child figures, saints holding lilies or swords, Christ with a hand raised in blessing. The room itself became a shrine of comfort, and yet the fear remained, for even the grandest castle could not hold back a nightmare. And so the prayers grew longer, the charms more elaborate. Fear did not vanish. It was dressed in ritual and softly sung to sleep. One curious custom, more common in rural and Celtic regions, was the laying of a silver coin near the crib. Silver, like iron, was thought to repel fairies and ill spirits, but unlike iron, silver was rarer, more precious, more powerful. A glint of it beside a sleeping infant was as good as a holy fire. Sometimes it was sewn into the child's bonnet or stitched into the hem of a night tunic. When illness struck a child in the night, or if a child became pale and silent and strange after a night's sleep, the medieval imagination did not turn to fever or infection alone. They whispered of changelings, of spirit, children swapped at night, and the way to know, they believed, was to watch the child in sleep. If it stirred oddly, if it smiled without waking, if it refused to be comforted in the old familiar way, a mother might sit through the night, candle flickering beside her, whispering prayers and gently brushing her child's cheek, hoping to coax the soul to return, or the spirit to flee. And yet, through all this fear and precaution, there was love. Endless, devoted love. Fear did not lead to cruelty. It led to care, to mothers watching silently through the dark, to fathers laying down by the door, guarding sleep like knights of the hearth, to the layering of protections upon protections, until a child could rest in a cocoon of old magic and holy hope. Sometimes, too, the village wise woman was consulted. She might bring a charm made from braided straw and ash to hang above the bed, or a sachet filled with protective herbs to be burned on a stone near the cradle. She might even sit with the child, murmuring in a dialect older than Latin, her words not entirely understood, but deeply believed. She didn't just soothe the child, she soothed the fear that sat behind the eyes of tired mothers, that clung to fathers' hands as they stirred the coals and stared out into the black. In some traditions, bells were used. Not loud ones, but tiny bells, sewn into the corners of a child's sleeping gown or placed above the doorway. It was believed that evil spirits despised the sound of bells, especially those blessed by a priest, and so, when a child shifted in sleep and a soft chime was heard, it wasn't jarring, it was comforting, a reminder that protection had not slept, even if the household had. Stories passed down warned children not to wander at night. Stay beneath the covers, they were told, the night folk walk when you do. A candle snuffed too soon might invite darkness in. A window left ajar might let in more than the breeze. These stories weren't meant to frighten, they were meant to instruct, to place children firmly within the circle of warmth, of safety, of ritual. And when a child cried out in their sleep, limbs tangled in blanket, voice trembling with the traces of a dream gone wrong, a mother's hand would reach without hesitation. The same chant, the same lullaby, the same quiet hymn would return like a familiar tide. Some families even kept a bowl of water near the hearth or the bed, side holy water if it could be obtained, or simply water that had sat beneath moonlight. If a child stirred uneasily, a finger dipped in the water would trace a symbol across their brow, a simple gesture, an ancient act, the belief that water, blessed or moonlit, could purify fear, and as night deepened, and the cottage or manor or keep fell to quiet, the fears too fell away, not because they were gone, but because they had been met by firelight, by prayer, by songs, by charms, by the steadfast watch of those who loved the child sleeping under their roof. So much of medieval bedtime was an act of guarding, not just against what might lurk beyond the walls, but against what might stir within a dreaming mind. Parents stood between their children and the unknown, with nothing more than soft words, flickering candles, and the stubborn power of belief. And now, in this modern moment, you are far from thatched roofs and shuttered keeps. There are no hags at the window, no fairies at the chimney, but perhaps still a part of you remembers the need to be held in a story, to be sung to sleep by someone who believes wholly that no harm can come to you tonight. So let your breath slow. Let the candle burn low in memory. Let the ancient bells fade into silence. The spirits have turned away. The door is barred. The child you once were is safe, and you now are safe too. The roll of cradle songs, chants, and nighttime blessings. There was a music in the Middle Ages that didn't echo through cathedrals or stir the feet of dancing villagers. It wasn't meant for festivals or feasts. It was quieter, softer, and wrapped around the hush of firelight and the sigh of straw beds. It was the music of the medieval night, the music of cradle songs and blessings, a sound not recorded in books, but remembered in the bones of those who once fell asleep beneath thatched ceilings, beneath skies clouded with stars and superstition. The lullaby in the medieval world was more than a gentle tune. It was a spell, a whispered shield woven with melody. A mother's voice was the first and last boundary between her child and the unknown dark. When the night crept in, thick and unsettled, a mother did not cry out in fear. She sang. And the song was a kind of magic, a living chant passed down not through script, but through repetition, heart to heart, generation after generation. You must imagine her, seated beside the cradle, the low fire casting flickering light along her cheek, her hands worn from labor, but gentle now. She hums something wordless at first, just a tone, a hum that wraps around the room like smoke. Then slowly the words arrive, ancient, soft, familiar. Lulla, lulla, little one, God above and saints anon. Sleep thou well and sleep thou deep, while angels guard thee as thou sleep. The rhyme may differ from village to village, but the soul of it is the same. The words hold no threat, only comfort, only the promise that sleep is not a lonely place. These lullabies weren't only about keeping children calm. They were songs stitched with prayers, for in the medieval world, the line between song and blessing was thin, often invisible. The act of singing a child to sleep was an act of invoking safety, not just physical safety, but spiritual too. Each note was a call to saints, each syllable a plea to the Virgin Mary or Saint Anne or Saint Christopher. There were lullabies in Latin, passed down by monks and scholars, and there were lullabies in the language of the peasant fields rough, rhyming English or lilting French, or the earthy pulse of Gaelic and Welsh. Some were structured like hymns, others like stories. Some told tales of Jesus sleeping in his cradle, wrapped in swaddling cloth, just like the child in the cot nearby. Others reminded the child that sleep was like a tiny death, but that waking would come with God's will and the sun. To modern ears, some of these songs might seem strange, somber even. They spoke of mortality, of the soul, of the need for divine protection through the long, vulnerable hours of night. But to medieval families there was comfort in honesty. Night could be cruel, but the voice of a mother or a father or a nursemaid could meet that cruelty with melody and make it bearable. In some regions it was the father who sang the lullaby, not often, but sometimes, particularly on nights when the mother was ill, or away, or had passed on, and the tone changed slightly, less melodic perhaps, but full of resolve. A chant that sounded more like a warrior's prayer than a lullaby, but which, to the child, was no less soothing. It said, "I am here. Nothing will harm you tonight." In wealthier homes, a nursemaid or wet nurse might be the one to sing. Often these women brought with them songs from their own villages, songs not known to the noble house, but welcomed for their unfamiliar, comforting rhythm. They sang of trees that whispered blessings, or of stars that watched from heaven, of forest spirits who bowed to Saint Mary when a child cried. The nobility may not have believed every word, but belief was not the point. The song worked, and the child slept. That was all that mattered. Nighttime blessings were spoken as well as sung. Simple phrases murmured while pulling up the blanket. "Christ be at thy head and foot, and angels spread thee wings above." Or, "God keep thee, child, from dream and dread, and let no evil near thy bed." Sometimes these blessings were accompanied by small gestures, a cross traced on the forehead with the thumb, or the laying of a hand over the heart. A pulse felt through woolen nightclothes as a mother whispered, "Let thy heart beat slow and safe. God is near." In monastic communities, where children might be raised as oblates dedicated to the church from a young age, the rituals of bedtime were more structured. Psalms were chanted at Compline, the final prayer service of the day, and young novices learned to fall asleep to the sound of their brothers' voices echoing through the stone corridors. There the lullaby was Gregorian, a wave of Latin flowing in slow cadences, filling the silence with sacred repetition. In manus tuas, Domine, commendo spir, item meum. Into your hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit. It was not just a phrase, it was a surrender, a recognition that sleep, like life, rested in God's hands. In poorer households, lullabies were sometimes hummed without words, just tones rising and falling like breath, not because words were unimportant, but because the day had been long and the mother had little left. So she let the hum carry the intent. The child, cradled in a trough lined with linen or nestled in straw, knew the sound, knew that the song meant warmth, meant peace, meant she was not alone. In cold months, the lullaby became a rhythm to rock by, a creaking cradle foot, pushed back and forth in time with the notes. In warmer months, it might be sung while the child was nursed, the candle flickering low, the beeswax scent mixing with the faint aroma of herbs strewn on the floor. Occasionally, the lullaby carried memory, a verse once sung to the mother by her own mother. And before that, the same words falling from lips centuries apart, yet identical in cadence, in hope. There were chants not for babies, but for older children too, those who had begun to understand the world and its shadows. These bedtime chants were more like spoken mantras, often repeated 3 times, with a special pause before sleep. I sleep in the Lord's name, I wake in His grace. The night is long, but His light surrounds me. Siblings might lie beside each other, whispering these blessings in unison, then curling in closer for warmth. No fire, no candle, no warmth like another's heartbeat against yours. In some places, the final words before sleep were not directed to the child at all, but to the room. The parent might bless the space aloud, naming the walls, the roof, the windows. A kind of ritual claiming of the space, turning a dark room into sacred ground. Bless this bed, this beam, this door, let no shade pass o'er the floor. Keep this house in holy care, and may no wicked dream walk there. A child would listen to this as the last sound of the day. And if their eyes were still open after the chant, they would often ask quietly, with a voice on the edge of sleep, "Will the saints watch?" And the parent would say yes, without hesitation. Yes, the saints are already watching. Sometimes the lullabies and blessings merged into lull stories. The mother or father would sing a fragment of a tale, of angels watching over shepherd boys, or of little saints who once fell asleep in fields and were guarded by animals through the night. These tales were soothing, but they carried a lesson: be kind, be faithful, rest in grace. They were sung not only to hush the body, but to shape the soul. And even when the child had long since drifted into sleep, the song might continue. A verse or two, murmured softly as the candle was pinched out. Not for the child any more, but for the singer, for the mother to release her worries into the dark, for the father to settle his heart after a day of toil. It was a lullaby for the soul, echoed into silence. Tonight, as you lie back in your own space, safe, far from medieval winds and ancient stones, you might still feel it. The echo of those songs, not the words perhaps, but the feeling, the slow rise and fall, the lull in lullaby. Let it carry you. Let it be your shield, your chant, your benediction. Whether it's sung or only imagined, that ancient rhythm is still yours. You do not sleep alone. There are voices in time softly singing just for you. Herbs, charms, and the soft superstitions that lingered by the bedside. Night in the medieval world was never simply a matter of closing one's eyes. It was a crossing, from light into dark, from known into unknown. The stars wheeled above like ancient watchmen, and the wind outside often seemed to carry voices that didn't belong to this world. For those who lived by firelight and faith, sleep was never taken lightly, and so they prepared for it with rituals both quiet and curious, blending plant and prayer, charm and caution. They stitched superstition into their sleep with the same care a mother might tuck in a child. The bed, even the simplest one, became a kind of altar. Around it, on shelves in corners, hanging from rafters, were small tokens of protection, subtle offerings to safety. Most were not grand: a sprig of dried rue, a pouch of lavender sewn shut with red thread, a circle of iron placed near the footpost. But each held meaning. Each whispered something to the darkness. You are not welcome here. Let us begin with the herbs. In the medieval mind, herbs were not just for flavor or healing. They were companions against the unseen. A bed stuffed with straw might also contain bunches of thyme or meadowsweet, tucked between the layers to mask odor, yes, but also to ward off illness and, more mysteriously, evil dreams. It was believed that certain scents kept the night spirits at bay. The logic wasn't always clear, but it didn't need to be. The tradition was older than memory. Lavender, with its calming aroma, was among the favorites. Dried and crumbled into small sachets, it was tied with linen ribbon and placed beneath pillows or hung above beds. Mothers would brush their hands along the stems as they sang their children to sleep, and the air would carry that faint, dusky scent, a promise of rest, a ward against nightmares. Rosemary was another, for remembrance, they said, and yet it was also hung by the bedside to keep away malevolent spirits. Some even bound sprigs of rosemary with iron nails, believing the combination of plant and metal would trap wandering demons before they could slip through the cracks of cottage doors. Chamomile was brewed into gentle teas for those whose nerves were shaken, or who had trouble closing their eyes after a fright. It was thought to soften the edges of the day and prepare the body for release. When sleep would not come, it was not uncommon for a woman to boil chamomile, pour the steam into a shallow basin, and place it near the bedside so the vapors could lull the restless into slumber. Then there were the more peculiar uses. St. John's wort, with its bright yellow flowers, was thought to be powerful against witches and nighttime visitations. It was picked on Midsummer's Eve, just as the sun began to dip, and hung in doorways or laid carefully on a window-sill. Its magic was strongest, they believed, when harvested in silence. Some households had a rule that no one could speak the herb's name aloud once it was placed by the bed. To do so might break its power. In more remote villages, mugwort was burned like incense, especially when a child was ill. The smoke, bitter and sharp, was said to purify the air, not in a medical sense, but in a spiritual one. Some believed it could banish dreams sent by those who cursed from afar, dreams that rode on the wind and entered through the ears. But herbs were only part of the ritual. Charms, small physical tokens, were another layer. A charm might be as simple as a carved piece of wood, often in the shape of a cross or a 5-pointed star, slipped under the pillow. Others were more elaborate. Small pouches sewn from old fabric and filled with a mixture of crushed herbs, bits of blessed wax, scraps of parchment with words too faded to read. Some of these charms were purchased from wandering cunning folk, wise women and hedge wizards who knew the old ways and offered protections for coin or barter. A charm might be worn on the body, especially if one had a tendency to sleepwalk or speak in dreams. A small iron ring around the toe, a cord tied loosely at the wrist, soaked in holy water. These weren't fashion. They were belief woven tightly into daily life. Some believed in placing protective stones near the bed. Jet was common, black and polished, believed to absorb harmful energy. Others preferred amber, warm to the touch, and often passed down from grandmother to mother to child. There were whispers that amber carried the essence of the sun, and that even in the darkest night it held a flicker of daylight within it. In wealthier homes, especially among those who had traveled or had access to foreign goods, exotic charms sometimes appeared. Amulets from the East, fragments of saintly relics, pages from devotional books, wrapped tightly in cloth and bound with thread. These were displayed on shelves near the bed, or even sewn into the hems of bed curtains. But perhaps the most intimate of these rituals were the blessings spoken aloud, not prayers exactly, but soft superstitions passed down through generations. A woman might whisper to herself as she banked the fire for the night, "Let no flame wander, let no ember rise, let no shadow stretch beyond what is wise." Then she'd turn to the bed, crossing herself, and murmur something less scripted, something personal, a blessing made from memory and instinct. Even the order of things held power, the left boot removed before the right. The bed entered from the right side only, a sip of water taken with eyes closed, so that no ill-see-me sleep. Superstition was less about logic and more about repetition, about doing the thing the same way every time until it became a kind of spell. Children absorbed these customs early. A girl might grow up knowing that she must always turn her pillow 3 times before lying down, or that if a cricket chirped too close to the bed, she must answer it in rhyme, or risk a week of bad dreams. Some customs came from fear, others from hope, and some from pure habit, worn smooth by the years. There were also charms spoken aloud when illness shadowed the house, for sleep in such moments was fragile. One had to lure it gently, convince it that the household was safe. So the head of the family might stand near the door and recite, "By bread, by salt, by beam and brick, let no spirit enter quick. By nail, by flame, by roof and stone, let this house be left alone." To the modern mind, these things may seem quaint, but in a world where storms shook wooden beams, where wolves howled from the woods, where fever came in the night and did not always leave, these small acts mattered. They gave form to fear. They gave people something to do with their hands before they surrendered to the dark. Even dreams were prepared for. In some households, a dream charm would be placed beneath the bed, an object meant not to stop dreams, but to guide them. A small figure carved of wood, or a straw doll bound with string. Some said these figures could carry the dreams for the sleeper, taking them to safer realms. There were nights when a person might wake from a nightmare, sit up and touch the charm with gratitude, murmuring, "You took the worst of it." In convents and monasteries, where sleep was broken by scheduled prayer, there were fewer physical charms. Instead, monks and nuns relied on ritualized Latin recitations. But even they, in their discipline, often wore small stitched relics tucked into their robes. Pieces of cloth blessed by bishops, threads from holy vestments. One monk wrote of a fragment of linen said to have touched the tomb of St. Cuthbert, kept under his pillow not for comfort, but for calm. And in the silence that followed these rituals once the herbs were placed, the chant whispered, The charm touched, there was a kind of stillness that descended. Not the stillness of emptiness, but of trust, of surrender. The medieval mind knew that not everything could be controlled, but it could be honored, appeased, respected. So the darkness came as it always did. But so did the rituals. The lavender tucked in linen, the rhyme said to the rafters, the iron at the door, and in that dance between belief and sleep, between superstition and silence, the night was made just a little gentler. Even now, when we close our eyes in modern rooms with electricity, humming, and concrete underfoot, something ancient lingers. A need to arrange our space just so, to take a sip of water, turn the pillow, check the door twice. These are not habits, they are echoes, echoes of centuries of sleepers who feared the night, but met it always with ritual. So sleep now, in your own way, with your own charms, your own quiet customs. You are not so different from those who came before, and they, in their time, are not so far from you. The gentle murmurs of prayer, sleep guided by devotion. As the sun disappeared behind the gables of timbered cottages and castle walls, stretched long shadows across the earth, the quiet of the medieval night began not with silence, but with murmurs. Gentle, steady, almost like a lullaby, half spoken and half thought, whispered into the folds of linen sheets and stone-chilled chambers. These murmurs were not idle talk, nor were they gossip or dreams, but prayers, soft, devout, and woven into the very fabric of sleep itself. For in medieval life, prayer was not an event or a chore. It was a rhythm, a pulse. It echoed throughout the day, in the tolling of bells, in the calls of monks from chapel cloisters, in the bending of knees before meals, and the signing of the cross upon leaving the house. But perhaps no prayer was more personal, more deeply whispered and barely formed, than the one said at bedtime. As night approached, and the fire was slowly reduced to a low amber glow, the inhabitants of a home would begin preparing not only their beds, but their spirits. The sense was not just that sleep was a time of rest, but that it was a kind of crossing, a vulnerable drift between this world and the next. And in that drift, prayer became both compass and shield. Many turned to the familiar cadence of the Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, in Latin or the vernacular, depending on one's education. It was a prayer not just for forgiveness or guidance, but for protection, a way of saying, I place myself in this stillness into your hands. Mothers whispered it while tucking their children into straw-filled mattresses. Old men muttered it while pulling the heavy woolen covers up to their chins. In every village, every cottage, every manor, these same words echoed just before darkness took hold. But bedtime prayers often extended beyond simple recitation. They were built into rituals. A woman might recite a list of saints' names, her own personal litany, as she folded back the bedclothes. Saint Agnes, keep me pure. Saint Barbara, keep me brave. Saint Christopher, see my dreams. Safely through, each name was a light against the dark. Each invocation, a gentle plea for watchful eyes to linger over her as she slept. There were prayers for every need. A soldier might whisper a psalm before sleep, asking that no blade find him in the dark. A farmer, hands calloused from work, might offer thanks for dry weather and a quiet belly. A child might recite a rhyme taught by a grandmother, shaped less like scripture and more like song. 4 corners to my bed, 4 angels at my head, 1 to watch and 1 to pray, and 2 to bear my soul away. This rhyme, passed from mouth to mouth, lingered for centuries in households across Europe. It was said in English and French, Latin and German, and always with the same rhythm. Not out of fear, but as comfort, as assurance that should the soul wander in sleep, it would not wander alone. Some prayers were deeply regional. In Ireland and Scotland, Gaelic bedtime blessings were spoken over the hearth as it was smoured, a process of banking the fire under ash to keep it smouldering until morning. As the last embers were covered, the speaker might say, I save the fire as Christ saved us all. Bless this hearth, this home, this hall. And then, turning to bed, they'd recite verses for protection against the fair folk. The spirits believed to travel by moonlight, curious and unpredictable. For not all prayers were Christian in shape. Many were older. Folk invocations preserved quietly beneath layers of church instruction. Prayers that spoke not to saints or angels, but to wind and water, earth and night. In monastic life, bedtime prayer took on a different shape. In monasteries, where the day was ruled by the divine hours, matins, lauds, prime, terce, and so on, bedtime was marked by compline. It was the last of the canonical hours, sung as the final shadows settled. Monks would gather in the chapel, candles flickering, and chant in low, unified voices, "Protect us, Lord, as we stay awake. Watch over us as we sleep, that awake we may keep watch with Christ, and asleep rest in his peace." These lines from the Liturgy of the Hours were chanted slowly, drawn out like a sacred breath. The echo of their voices against stone walls, the scent of beeswax and incense, the faint rustling of robes, all formed a kind of music designed to lull the soul toward calm. After compline, a monk might walk silently to his cell, cloaked and candle-lit, and recite a final personal prayer before sleep. He would often sleep on a hard wooden bed, covered only by rough blankets, but his rest was softened by devotion. In noble houses, prayers before sleep were sometimes more elaborate, spoken not alone, but with chaplains or servants present. A nobleman might kneel in a private chapel adjoining his chambers, reading from an illuminated book of hours. These books were often family heirlooms, filled with intricate illustrations and marginalia. A wealthy woman might hold a candle near the pages and trace the script with her finger, reciting each line slowly, her face washed in gold and shadow. Yet despite these differences in wealth and setting, the purpose remained the same: to prepare the soul for sleep, to ask not just for safety from harm, but for peace in dreams. For some, that meant praying for visions, messages from saints, or from lost loved ones. For others, it meant pleading for dreamless rest, where memory could not follow and fear could not stir. And then there were those who struggled to pray. A widow, alone in her cottage, might sit long by the hearth before saying anything at all. Her prayers were silent, stitched together from longing and grief. She might light a candle for her husband, gone these 5 winters, and speak to the air more than to heaven. Watch over him if he wanders. Watch over me if I dream of him. In such moments, prayer was not theology. It was not even hope. It was a habit of the heart. Children were taught to pray from the moment they could form words. Often their prayers were chanted in rhyme, simple, sweet, and repetitive. A mother might kneel beside her child's bed and guide her small hands through the motions of the cross. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost, bless me, keep me, hold me close. The words might not be fully understood, but the act became familiar, reassuring, like a nightly song sung just for them. And not all prayers were spoken aloud. Some were written, scratched onto bits of parchment, and slipped under pillows. Others were embroidered into linens, so faint that only the sleeper would know. A woman might stitch a line from a psalm into the hem of a child's sleeping gown. A man might carry a folded prayer inside a pouch around his neck. These prayers traveled with the body into sleep. Invisible but felt, the fear of night was very real in the medieval world, not simply of wild animals or robbers, but of spirits, of demons, of death. Night was when plague crept quietly through towns, when strange noises stirred from the woods, when illness took its final turn, and so the prayer became a talisman, not to banish fear, but to hold it at bay. Yet, despite this fear, the act of prayer offered serenity. The repetition of words, the slow cadence, the rhythmic crossing of oneself, it was all part of a spiritual choreography that guided the mind away from the anxieties of the day. Much like a lullaby or a bedtime story, prayer created a safe boundary between the world of labor and the world of dreams. Over time, Generations forgot the exact words, but not the impulse. Even now, in quieter moments before sleep, many still instinctively murmur a word of thanks, a plea for peace, or a name they wish to remember. They close their eyes with thoughts shaped like old prayers, fragmented, humble, quiet, a whisper into the dark. And perhaps that is the oldest ritual of all, not the prayer itself, but the moment before sleep when one pauses, when one acknowledges the mystery of the night, the gift of rest and the hope of waking. So as you settle under your own covers, whether thick wool or light cotton, whether beneath oak beams or modern ceilings, know that you are part of a very old tradition, one that began not with doctrine, but with breath, with murmur, with devotion whispered between heartbeats. Let your own gentle murmurs rise like smoke. Let them guide you slowly into the stillness. You are not alone. Sounds of the night, owls, wind, and the gentle moan of wood. When the last candle was snuffed out and hearths were banked beneath grey ash, the darkness of medieval night was nearly complete. There were no glowing clocks, no distant car horns or buzzing street lamps, only the endless stretch of black, pierced by starlight and moonbeams when clouds allowed. And in this velvet darkness, sound became a lantern of its own, quiet and eerie and intimately known. For the people of the Middle Ages, nighttime had its own voice, unlike any other part of the day. To fall asleep in that time was to give oneself over not just to dreams, but to the chorus of the earth around you. The creaks and sighs of wooden beams above, the distant call of an owl, the groaning shift of doors in their hinges, these were not disturbances. They were companions. The owl, above all, was the songstress of the medieval night. Her call, low and haunting, seemed to spiral through the air like a secret. In some regions her hoot was believed to be an omen, a warning of death. In others it was just a sign that the forest was alive and listening. But either way, it was a constant and echo that drifted through open shutters and wattle walls, into the spaces where sleep was just beginning. Sometimes it was a barn owl, with a sharp shriek that sent a ripple down one's spine. Other times it was the soft, rhythmic woo of a tawny owl, so soothing it might lull even a restless child. In country homes, people would pause upon hearing it not in fear, but in familiarity. The owl's voice was a marker. The night was truly underway. Wind played its part too, never quite still. Through the slats of shutters, across the roofs of thatched cottages, it hummed and whispered, and, when it gathered enough strength, groaned. It didn't howl often, but it murmured. It slid under doors and pressed against wooden frames, as if testing their resolve. At times it made window panes rattle softly, or caused ropes to tap rhythmically against beams in the barnyard. People grew used to it, came to trust it. Wind was an old friend, one who could be stern but mostly told gentle stories if you listened long enough. Inside the homes, even in stillness, nothing was ever truly silent. The beds themselves were sources of sound. Many were made of wood, dry and uneven, and when you shifted your weight, the joints creaked. A turn in sleep might be met with a groan from the bed frame, or a faint rustle from the straw-filled mattress below. These sounds, rather than annoyances, were reassurances. They said, "You are here, you are warm, the bed is holding you." Above, the rafters would moan and shift as the house cooled. Heat left the timber slowly, and the beams, so alive during the day, now relaxed with aching sighs. A small pop here, a wooden crack there, each one a note in the slow lullaby of architecture. Some believed the house spoke during the night, telling tales of its own memories. A child might be told, "That sound you hear, it's the roof settling into sleep." In villages and hamlets, night sounds differed subtly. In rural homes, one might hear the faint snort of animals, pigs in the sty, cows rustling in their stalls. Chickens sometimes stirred on their perches, disturbed by nothing more than a change in the wind. In places where livestock slept close to humans, a low moan from a cow or a sleepy bleat from a goat was as ordinary as a sibling's breath. Dogs might shuffle near the hearth, their nails ticking softly against the stone floor before curling back into warmth. A sudden bark could ripple through the night, perhaps at a fox in the distance, or simply at a shadow too deep to trust. Then silence would return, thicker than before, and the dog would settle once more. In towns and cities, the sounds were different. The narrow alleys between houses carried echoes longer. A shout, far off, might travel like a ghost. The clatter of a cartwheel against uneven stone, late and unexplained, might stir uneasy thoughts. But even in urban nightscapes there were patterns. Cats yowled in mating dances. Night watchmen rang their bells, calling the hours. 10 o'clock, and all is well. Their voices were hollow, familiar, sometimes weary, but they were a comfort too, signs that someone was awake while you slept. There was the sound of dripping. In many homes, water collected in barrels or basins from earlier rain. A slow, rhythmic plink of water falling from a beam or eave was a sound that might accompany one into dreams. It was not uncommon for such sounds to find their way into prayer. May my sleep fall as gently as rain into the barrel. Someone might whisper. In grander houses the soundscape shifted again. Castles with their thick stone walls carried echo in a strange way. Footsteps in distant halls rang clear, even muffled. The flap of tapestry or the sway of a heavy curtain could whisper like a voice. In such places even silence felt heavy, as though it had weight. Servants padded quietly down corridors. A fire in the great hall hissed and spat even as it dwindled. Somewhere, high above, a sentry shifted, his chainmail giving a small clink as he moved along the wall walk. In some cases, people placed importance on hearing, or not hearing certain sounds. To hear the screech of a barn owl was to be reminded of the old tales. She flies for the souls of the lost, some said. Others claimed that if you heard an owl 3 nights in a row, someone in the house would fall ill. But these were not universal fears. For many, the sound of birds, wind, and even distant thunder was simply nature performing its midnight duties. Rain was especially welcome. It softened the sounds of the world, turning even the hardest roof into a gentle drum. On rainy nights, people slept more easily. The rhythmic patter above created a cocoon of sound, a coverlet for the ears. There was even a phrase in some parts of England, sleeping under St. Swithin's tears, referring to the comforting nature of sleeping through summer rain. And of course there was the most delicate of sounds, the human breath. In a shared bed, one would grow accustomed to the rise and fall of another's breathing. Spouses tuned their own sleep to the cadence of the other's inhale and exhale. Parents would sleep with a child nestled close, adjusting to the tiny snuffling breaths of the little one. Over time, these became lullabies themselves. You knew your loved ones were safe by the sounds they made as they slept. Snoring, too, was not the nuisance we often treat it as today. It was a natural part of the sleep soundscape, as accepted as the creak of wood or the song of an owl. In fact, in some households it was said with gentle humor, the louder the snore, the sounder the sleep. It meant the house was at rest, filled with full bellies and tired bones. The sounds of illness, on the other hand, carried a different weight. A cough in the night could stir anxiety. A fevered moan might make others lie awake, offering whispered prayers for recovery. Yet even these sounds were met with compassion rather than dread. They were part of the night, part of life, the human world and the natural world blending into one lullaby of murmurs, whistles, sighs, and rustlings. Occasionally there were sounds that defied explanation, a sudden knock, though no one at the door, a creak on the stair, though all were accounted for. In such cases, one might whisper a quick protection, in nomine patris, et filii, et spiritus sancti, not out of deep fear, but out of reverence, for the night was mysterious. It belonged to things beyond easy naming. To the medieval mind, the world was never truly quiet. Silence, in its purest form, did not exist. Even the deepest night was filled with sound natural, spiritual, living. These sounds were not interruptions. They were part of the bedtime ritual. They marked the passage from waking to sleeping. They grounded the soul in the present and at times hinted at the beyond. And so, as one lay back on a mattress stuffed with straw or feathers, wrapped in wool or linen, the sounds of the night did their gentle work. They didn't call attention to themselves. They didn't beg to be heard. They simply were, reliable, ancient, and ever present. Tonight, as you lay your own head down to sleep, you may hear your own version of those sounds. A tree brushing against the window, a cat padding quietly down the hallway, the hum of a distant fan. These are your owls, your wooden rafters. Your night watchmen, close your eyes, let them speak to you, not with urgency, but with age-old calm. Let them carry you back to a time when the night itself was sacred, and every creak and murmur was a sign that the world, though dark, was very much alive. You are part of that world still, when the fire went out, the symbolism of embers fading. The room was dim, its edges disappearing into a darkness that seemed not frightening, but soft, velvety, warm, familiar. The only thing holding back the total night was the hearth at the center of the space, where the last traces of flame clung to the wood like reluctant spirits. It was not a roaring fire now, not even a steady one, just a scattering of orange-red embers, pulsing faintly like the slowing heartbeat of the day. For medieval households, the moment when the fire went out was a turning point. The fire was not merely heat, it was the center of life. Its glow had lit evening meals, warmed hands and feet, boiled broth, dried wet boots, and soothed weary bones. Around it, songs had been sung, prayers had been whispered, children had been scolded or rocked to sleep. And now, as it dimmed into silence, so too did the house. To watch the embers fade was to watch the end of the day in miniature. A miniature death, yes, but a peaceful one that whispered closure. The hiss of sap in the wood had grown quiet. The sharp crackling of flames had been replaced by gentle pops, like the fire giving its last few sighs. Soon there would be nothing but a bed of ash, faintly warm, waiting to be rekindled come morning. This fading was never abrupt. It was a slow and reverent process. Some families remained nearby even as the fire dwindled. There was something spiritual about staying close to it, as if paying respect to a companion who had served faithfully from dawn to dusk. You might sit with your knees pulled to your chest, watching the glowing coals dim and blink out one by one, each fading like a tiny sun sliding beneath its own horizon. For many, this moment had ritual meaning. The fire represented the hearth, spirit called by some traditions domovoi, or hearth guardian, an unseen protector of the home. As long as the fire burned, so too did that protection. So the act of tending it was almost priestly. When it was time for sleep, one didn't simply let the fire die out. One banked. It covered it gently with ash to preserve the inner heat until morning. A glowing coal could mean the difference between warmth and hardship the next day. This quiet tending was part of the bedtime rhythm. A woman of the house might kneel by the hearth, lifting her skirts above the ash and using a fire iron to shift the coals just so, speaking a soft charm under her breath. Something like, rest and burn low, sleep until the cock crows. It was half prayer, half instruction spoken not to the fire alone, but to the household at large. In noble homes and castles, the fireplaces were grander, taller, wide enough to walk into. Yet even there, the quiet fade of fire had a kind of gravity. In the great hall, servants would rake the embers into safer banks before sleep claimed the last few men at the long tables. The flicker of light would dance on stone columns, casting shadowy giants on the walls. As the fire sank into ember glow, the hall became a chamber of echoes and hush. There was also a kind of magic in the way light changed when fire became ember. Flames were lively, yellow, flickering, chaotic. Embers were slower, red and soft like breath. They didn't dance, they glowed, and that glow had an intimacy to it. It invited reflection. It pulled the eye and the mind inward, away from speech, away from the day's demands. You didn't tell stories by Firelight, you remembered them. It was during this time that many people gave their final thoughts to God. In homes where prayer books were scarce or non-existent, the fire became the altar. Men and women might cross themselves by the dim hearth, say an Ave Maria, or whisper a prayer for protection through the night. Deliver us from wolves and from wicked dreams. It was a holy pause between wakefulness and sleep, like standing at the edge of a forest before stepping into the unknown. And children, sleepy-eyed and wrapped in wool, were often drawn to the last firelight. A mother might let them sit for a moment, their little faces bathed in the low amber glow. She'd remind them gently that the fire was going to sleep too, that even it needed rest. Some children were told stories very quietly about fire spirits who only came out once the flame had gone low, slipping between the embers to keep watch. These weren't frightening tales. They were gentle myths, designed to comfort and cradle a child's imagination as they drifted off. The symbolism of the fire's end went beyond warmth and light. It was a reminder of mortality. Just as the fire had been built, fed, grown strong, and now faded, so too did every life. People in the Middle Ages were intimately aware of this rhythm. Birth and death, sunrise and sunset, flame and ember. Each mirrored the others. Watching the fire go out was not sad. It was natural. It was part of the world's breathing. There were folk beliefs, too, that played into this nightly ritual. Some said never to let the fire go completely out in case spirits tried to enter through the chimney. Others believed a warm hearth discouraged illness. The fire was seen not just as warmth, but as barrier, as guardian, as soul of the home. Without it, the house was vulnerable. So letting it fade was not an act taken lightly. It was, in its own way, sacred. In monasteries, the dying fire had a similar weight. Monks would take turns tending the night fire, making sure it did not vanish entirely before the next day's psalms. The flickering coals became a metaphor for prayer itself constant, even when no one watched. The monk who watched the fire might sit in silence, reflecting on the day, the scriptures, or simply listening to the creaking of the wooden beams above. His only companion, the ember's pulse. Sometimes the smell of the fire's end was its own language. The scent of ash, mingled with the last burnt traces of oak or beech, hung in the air like a benediction. It was a dry, ancient smell one that clung to woolen tunics and hair, settling into the fibers of life. To medieval people, that scent meant home. It meant food had been cooked, stories had been shared, warmth had embraced their skin. It was the perfume of presence, of security. There were also traditions that marked the ember moment with gestures. Some kissed their fingers and touched them to the hearthstone. Others placed a few herbs on the cooling coals, lavender, perhaps, or rosemary, so that the last breath of the fire would be sweet. In winter, a larger log might be placed nearby, not to burn immediately, but as a kind of promise to tomorrow's dawn. Fire always returns, they believed. Embers never truly die if tended well. By the time the last ember darkened, the house had transformed. It was no longer a place of labor and living. It was a nest folded into itself. Even in large halls, the shrinking fire signaled quiet. Conversation slowed, words became whispers, and people began to rise and move toward their sleeping spaces. The glow of the hearth had marked time now, it said. Enough. Rest. And when darkness finally claimed the fire, what remained was not emptiness. It was memory, a warmth that lingered in the stone, in the air, in the heart. A silence filled not with absence, but with depth. Sleep came more easily then, in a room touched by firelight that once danced, now gone. The bed was cooler now, yes, but the soul had been softened by the slow fade. So much meaning tied to a handful of embers, a final flicker, a final pop, the end of heat, of light, of movement. And yet, how gentle that end was. not like a candle snuffed in haste, no more like a sigh, a long, sleepy exhale from a world that had given all it could for one day. Tonight, as your own world quiets down, perhaps you can imagine that ember, not the flame that roared or the blaze that burned bright, just the steady, glowing coal calm and low and deeply alive. Let it be your image of rest. Let it remind you that endings can be beautiful, that silence can be warm, that even in the dark the memory of light remains. You are safe now. The fire has slept, and soon you will too. And now, dear listener, as the final echoes of medieval footsteps fade into the distance, as the candle stubs melt low and the hearth embers retreat into soft ash, let your thoughts settle as the village once did under starlit skies. The shutters have closed, the night watch walks his final round, and even the owls have grown quiet. You've wandered through linen-draped chambers, listened to prayers by firelight, and felt the hush of a world that moved more slowly. One where bedtime was not a break from life, but a sacred part of it. So as you lie back now, wrapped in your own quiet comfort, let the hush of those old rituals soothe you. Let the rhythm of the past slow your breath, and the soft flicker of imagined torchlight guide you deeper into rest. Sleep peacefully, and know that somewhere long ago others drifted off just like this beneath timber beams and woolen sheets, hearts quieted by the stillness of night. Good night, traveler. Sleep well.